Hello, this is Ingo Swann, the author of Penetration, the question of extraterrestrial and human telepathy. And you're listening to the wonderful 21st Century Radio with the amazing Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
Well, welcome back to 21st Century Radio, our 32nd year of continuous broadcasting. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronymus, and our executive producer and research assistant who did the majority of the legwork for this show tonight, working day and night for the last week or so, is Dr. Laura Kortner, celebrating her birthday tonight. And our engineer is Anita Brockington. 2 hours tonight on the question of extraterrestrial and human telepathy. That's the subtitle to psychic Ingo Swann's 1998 bombshell of a book called Penetration. We interviewed Ingo for 4 hours about this book when it first came out, and we'll play a few excerpts tonight. Ingo died in 2013, and when his estate moved his research archives to University of West Georgia, the researchers there started making new discoveries among his files. One was a previously unknown chapter detailing a previously unknown remote viewing target, the planet Mars. For some reason, Ingo decided to withhold this one chapter from a book that was already quite shocking. The startling revelations in the original book detailed Ingo's experiences with a deep black agency that included witnessing a huge UFO materialize near the Arctic Circle. He was also sent psychically to observe the moon, where he discovered the moon has, listen to this, an atmosphere, occupants, and artificial structures. The newly discovered chapter has equally as startling revelations about the planet Mars in 1975 and 1976, and again in 1984. Ingo organized a small group of psychics to simultaneously remote view Mars, and when they compared notes, the reports were all the same. In the Cydonia region, where the face on Mars was observed, there can be seen the ruins of a destroyed ancient civilization. We have 4 guests tonight representing the best in parapsychological and Mars anomaly research, and together we will try to piece together why our military and intelligence communities are so interested in psychics and in Mars, the moon, and the pyramids of Egypt, and why they don't want you to know about it. Our first guest is Stefan Schwartz, who, for 40 years, has been studying the nature of consciousness, particularly that aspect independent of space and time. Schwartz is part of the small group that founded modern remote viewing research and is the principal researcher studying the use of remote viewing in archaeology. He is the author of numerous books and technical papers on remote viewing and archaeology, anthropology, medicine and healing, creativity and social policy, and has conducted groundbreaking research exploring non-local aspects of consciousness, including healing effects. He has published widely in popular and peer-reviewed journals and is a frequent guest on 21st Century Radio. By the way, his first appearance on 21st Century Radio was 1989. He was a close friend and colleague of Ingo Swann and knew him well. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Stefan Schwartz.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing really well. How you doing?
I'm doing well.
So we're both doing well. Well, what do you know about that? Well, Stephen, you have read Ingo Swann's account of remote viewing Mars and the moon in the special edition of Penetration. What do you think of these revelations?
Well, I will tell you that I think, Bob, that much of it is misunderstood because people don't understand how the nature of non-local consciousness and how it works. So when Ingo got the idea of having multiple people do the same remote viewing independently, that came out of Mobius, my laboratory, where Ingo was a regular participant. He part in a number of experiments we did. When you ask people to look at something, what happens is they're drawn to the most numinous manifestation of whatever it is you're asking. So I suspect that when he's talking about these Mars structures, the stuff on the moon, what he's really talking about is stuff that lies in the future, not in the past. Let me give you two other examples of this. When I was doing the Alexandria project, a large remote viewing project to locate Cleopatra's Palace, the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, Alexander the Great's tomb, and other things, Mark Antony's palace. A number of the people who described the Soma, that's the tomb of Alexander, it's generally described as being having a kind of dome-like top, but several of them described a kind of pyramid top. And that was very confusing, and to a lot of people, it seemed that they were just wrong, pyramids, Egypt. But when I went to talk to Peter Fraser, who was the world's leading authority on the history of Alexandria at that time, at All Souls College in Oxford, he said, what people don't generally know is that one of the later Ptolemies, Ptolemy Soter, who was Alexander's general, became the leader of Alexandria in Egypt. One of the later Ptolemies, I think it was Ptolemy Philadelphus, changed the dome shape to a pyramid shape on the Soma, this structure that they built for the tomb of Alexander in this crystal coffin, which is, by the way, where Stalin got the idea for Lenin's crystal coffin. Oh. But in any case, they were drawn to not what I thought I was asking, but they were drawn to the most numinous, that is the most emotionally engaging aspect of the history of that structure. So in non-local consciousness, another example is Pat Price did a remote viewing for Russell Targ at SRI about a location, and he described the location not as it is, but as it was in the past, at a time when it was an active site and as opposed to a more or less much lesser used site. So people are drawn to the most numinous manifestation of whatever it is you're asking them. And I suspect in rereading this chapter, that the lost chapter as they describe it, I remember when they were doing these experiments, I knew Harold Sherman very well and the other people that were involved. When they were doing this, we didn't understand very clearly about this issue of time and numinosity. And so when they look at it, I think what they may be looking at is the future, since there have been no discoveries that would tend to authenticate what they described. And that may be the reason that Ingo left that chapter out, is that it did not seem to be validated by what subsequent the Viking and other space probes discovered. I don't know this to be true, but I just suspect that it would be very hard to keep secret the fact that some lost culture had been found on Mars or the moon. I mean, I know people have all these deep conspiracy ideas, but, somebody always talks. You can see that going on in the Trump administration now. So I think what instead of the past he's talking about is that they were describing things which will be there in the future. And if you look at, for instance, Elon Musk's plans, or you look at what NASA's talking about, or what the Chinese are talking about, it does sound a great deal like what Harold and Ingo were describing.
Well, I'm a little bit confused here. So But you're basically saying that what we're talking about was a totally different time period, and not the past, but the future.
What I'm saying is, in non-local consciousness, time is a information enricher, but it is not a delimiter. People who you ask to do remote viewings of places often go not to where you think they're going, but they are drawn to the most numinous, noumena, to quote Carl Jung, noumena are psychic entia. They are outside of space and time, and I think what he's really saying is that this is information, because I think the big mystery question for me is, are there two of them? What is consciousness and what is information? But in any case, when you ask people to remote view descriptions of things, what they tend to do is to go to the place that is the most emotionally engaging. And so if you're looking at something that is barren at the moment, but either in the past or in the future is going to become something that is active and has a lot of focused attention on it, then that's what people will describe. Ted Sirios, who could produce images on film, when he was asked to do so, often produced not the image that they thought they were going to get, but the image of that site at its most active and emotionally engaging. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying to you is that when you talk about remote viewing a place, you cannot assume that time is linear as it is in space-time. Mm-hmm. You have to think about it as which is the most numinous part of history, and I think that of the history of whatever it is you're asking, and I think that's what Ingo did, and I also think that's probably why he left that chapter out.
Okay, well, I understand Ingo was so intent to use a group of remote viewers for his 1984 trek to Mars because he learned that from you, right? You showed him that a group of psychics working together at the same time and with the same target generates an increase in psychic power of them all. Why is that?
Well, it's the same reason that intelligence agencies use multiple sources, or that investigative journalists use multiple sources. I mean, suppose there was an explosion outside of your studio right now. What would you do? Well, you'd go out to see what happened. And you'd see a bunch of people clustered around, and what would you do? Well, you'd go up to them individually and say, well, what did you see? And each person would describe what they saw from their vantage point and with their biases. We know, for instance, that if you ask people to describe cars, men are more likely to get the make of the car, and women are more likely to get the color of the car. So people have, they have biases that are built in, and they see things from different angles. But if you put together the collective responses that they give you, and you look for where there is consensus or low a priori probability, that is, if you say the captain had an amethyst chandelier in his cabin, well, you don't expect to see that. Whereas if you say, well, there's an anchor, you're describing a ship, well, of course there's an anchor. It's a ship. So when you put all the data together, that's what Ingo learned. It's called the Mobius Consensus Protocol. What you do is you put in all the comments that everybody makes, and what you're looking for is, just like the intelligence community or investigative journalists, is you're looking for consensus, and you're looking for odd little observations which people wouldn't normally make, and that's what he did. He had experienced that going all the way back to Deep Quest in 1977, when we located a wreck on the seafloor using a submarine, and he was very impressed with that protocol, the consensus protocol, so that's what he did.
Okay, now at various points in penetration, Ingo asks why, quote, mass consciousness humans conspire to avoid certain issues such as telepathy. Stefan, you've been studying this for a long time. What is your theory on why telepathy and parapsychology in general remain taboo for researchers?
Well, this all traces back to the Council of Trent. Between 1545 and 1563, the Roman Catholic Church, which was beginning to be faced by the uprising of the Protestant Reformation and also by the development of science, became very alarmed that their power over the community was being threatened. And so between those 1545, 1563, they had 25 meetings. And they ended up issuing a kind of edict. And the edict was everything that has to do with consciousness, they called it spirit. Everything that has to do with spirit, read consciousness, that's our domain, the domain of the church. And you guys in science who are just getting started, you can have everything that's in space-time, everything that's physical. And that's fine. We're okay with that. If you come over into our realm, consciousness, and we can get hold of you, why, we're going to kill you. And in fact, we're going to torture you and burn you alive.
Yeah, they did a lot.
And they did a lot of it. They authorized the establishment of torture chambers. And the Dominicans particularly became involved with it. Anyway, so what happened was there was a kind of taboo. And scientists who, because the church at that time was universal largely in the West, if you got involved with consciousness, you just didn't talk about it very much. I mean, Newton certainly had very strong feelings about it, but it became a taboo, and then science was very exciting. It was just getting started. And so there was lots of stuff to do, and it shamed and embarrassed scientists that they couldn't talk about consciousness. So as materialism arose, consciousness just retreated, and until it just wasn't talked about. The last person to be killed by the Inquisition was in 1826. In Spain, that was a teacher who was telling his students about deism, and until the late 19th century, consciousness was a taboo. And then in the 19th century, parapsychology, psychology, anthropology, psychiatry all began to develop and began to talk about consciousness. And now here we are in the 21st century, and it's becoming increasingly clear, although materialism is still the principle, the dominant paradigm, it's becoming increasingly clear to a growing number of scientists that you must make consciousness causal and fundamental. I mean, in 1931, Max Planck was interviewed by the Observer newspaper, and they said to him, I don't know what they thought he was going to say, but anyway, they said to him, what have you learned? You and Einstein are the two most famous scientists in the world. And what he said to them, what I've learned, I think they thought he was going to talk about atoms. What I've learned is that consciousness is causal and fundamental. You cannot get behind consciousness. Consciousness, space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time, as materialism would have it. And we now see that this paradigm of materialism is changing. I mean, not only is it changing in science, but it's also changing in the popular culture. There are now 15 television series in which time travel is part of the narrative, and another 15 in which consciousness is a principal part of the narrative. So we are preparing to go through a paradigm change, just exactly as Thomas Kuhn described.
Well, it's about time. That's all I can say about that. Well, these remote viewing targets appear to connect questions about Mars to questions about the pyramid and Sphinx in Egypt. What do you speculate the connection might be, if there is one?
I don't think there is one.
Okay.
When I did Egyptian work, Bob, when I was doing this large project, went on for 5 years, I very deliberately chose to focus on Ptolemaic Egypt. That's from Alexander the Great through the Ptolemies, about 300 some years, as opposed to Pharaonic Egypt. And the reason I did that was that in non-local consciousness, something that is strongly believed to be true is perceived as being true. It doesn't have to be true, but if a lot of people believe it to be true, then it's a kind of thought form, for want of a better term. And the connection of the pyramids with extraterrestrials and Atlanteans, that's the other big thing, of course.
Of course, yes.
Arises largely as a result of the Theosophists.
But right now, largely we're almost out of time, unfortunately, darn it.
Okay.
And
anyway,
go ahead.
Final thought. I think what we're looking at is a connection that exists as a myth in non-local consciousness, but that is not, in fact, an actually true thing.
Are you donating your archives to the University of West Georgia?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that. My doctoral thesis is down there now, and I'm sending other books down there. Thank you for joining us, Stephen Swartz. Buy his book, The Alexandria Project, and his other titles and numerous research articles at www.schwartzreport.net. Before we go to commercial, I have to say that this show would not be happening without L.A. Flippin, Ingo Swann's niece and executor of his estate. Visit the many websites like ingoswann.com that we have posted at 21stcenturyradio.com and read the history of remote viewing, see Ingo's other books and his cosmic artwork. Much of it on display at the American Visionary Art Museum right here in Baltimore. Because of limited time, this program tonight is designed as an advanced course for those already familiar with these subjects. If you're not, please do yourself the favor and take the time to read these websites and get fully informed. Coming up next is Dr. Stanley Krippner, who was present for the first remote viewing session to Mars that Ingo did in 1975. We'll be right back.
This is George Norrie. Also, Bob, I wanted to thank you for the contribution you've made to all of us in this country, for the format that you've given us for years, way longer than me. And without you around, we wouldn't be the same.
Hello, this is Ellie Flippin, niece of the late psychic, visionary, artist, and extraordinary individual, Ingo Swann. You can learn more about his archives, his paintings, and his books at ingoswann.com. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
Well, as you say,
Is that what you had in mind?
Well, we're still moving towards it,
Okay.
Ingo. The big four of five then are clinging to a particular definition of consciousness, and they do not want to accept group consciousness or telepathy as the melding of consciousness.
That's right.
Because this means there is an independent, objective means of transfer.
That's right.
Now, I find that very important and very
Well,
interesting.
you just said it better than I could. I tend to get really wordy about these things.
Well, that's only because I've read your book 3 times. I've read it backwards and
that
forwards,
it?
inside and out. Because
no, it's because you are who you are. You're a great person yourself, and you're used to making things sound easy.
the voice of Ingo Swann back in 1999 when this book was new and we talked to him about it for the first time. Our next guest is Dr. Stanley Krippner, the chairman of my doctoral committee and one of my mentors. Stanley Krippner has written extensively on altered states of consciousness, dream telepathy, hypnosis, shamanism, disassociation, and parapsychological subjects. He is a former president of the American Psychological Association, former professor of Saybrook University, former director of the Dream Research Laboratory at Maimonides Medical Center. He has joined us many times on 21st Century Radio, starting way back in 1988. 1988, Stan. Welcome back.
Well, thank you very much.
Glad
and I really have to correct something in your introduction before the walls come tumbling down.
Okay.
I was never president of the American Psychological Association. I was president of 2 divisions of the American Psychological Association, Humanistic Psychology and Hypnosis, but there are 60 divisions in the American Psychological Association, and they all have presidents for 1-year terms. So with that little correction, we can move ahead.
Thank you very much, Stan. I was not aware of that, obviously. As a longtime friend and colleague of Ingo Swann, Stan Krippner was invited to observe the first remote viewing session Ingo did of Mars in 1975. So, welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Stan. Let's get right to it. You had already shared a number of interesting experiments with Ingo when he invited you in 1975 to observe his first psychic probe of Mars. You wrote in your introduction to the special edition of Penetration how you were struck by how informal Ingo was beforehand. You and your wife were rather excited at what lay ahead, but Ingo was casual. Ingo's account says the directions he gave to his fellow psychic Harold Sherman in Arkansas were simply just go to the other side of the sun and then look for the tiny red planet. Was there no envelope concealing latitude and longitude coordinates of any kind given at that time?
Well, there really weren't, because Ingo and Harold, both of them knew where Mars was and knew that that was their destination. I actually had met Harold Sherman before I met Ingo. We were on a radio show together many, many years before that, and I had been on several programs with him. He was a real pioneer himself, and we had some wonderful conversations together. Now, in terms of the visit to Ingo, yes, my wife and I arrived at his apartment, and he was very casual, wearing casual clothes, even was smoking a little small cigar during part of the session, and he didn't use any fancy induction techniques or self-hypnosis or chants, or certainly not any drugs or incense. He just got right down to work. It was quite a remarkable presentation.
Well, Ingo described a sensation of disappearing completely along with his body, which prevented him from sketching what he saw. Do you remember him starting to talk for the recorder and what you and the other observers were doing when he reported seeing artificial structures on Mars?
Well, you're right. This is his attitude. I remember him talking to me about that. And there was certainly nothing artificial about Ingo. He, as I think everybody knows, went through the whole Scientology program, for better or for worse, some years before. Mm-hmm. Not that he was devoted to the Scientology philosophy, but he felt that many of their exercises were very useful. And somebody like Ingo certainly is open to all the new techniques, all the new procedures that they can find. Then they work out their own way of doing things, and Ingo's was very, very unique.
He sure is, yeah. Well, what happened when the experiment was over and an excited Harold Sherman called from Arkansas to compare notes with an excited Ingo? Were you as excited as they were?
Well, I was able to hear Harold. I don't remember how the phone was set up. My hearing was much better in those days than it is now. We might even have been listening in on the same phone. But he and Ingo were in good rapport and had everything very well synchronized.
Well, for our listeners, let me read just a few excerpts of what Harold and Ingo saw so you know why they were so excited. That is, especially our listeners. And by the way, friends, the transcripts of this entire session are on file with the University of West Georgia Archives. Harold Sherman saw this on Mars, quote, dome-like structures, great mounds which give evidence of some form of intelligent life, feeling a higher form of life has existed here and may have gone underground, and objects in the sky some miles above the surface, either moons or satellites, at least 5 of them. And here's what Ingo Swann saw on Mars in 1975. Quote, it looks like one of those towers that carry high voltage lines. It is man-made, and it is structured, and it is bent, and no longer in use. Something that looks like a checkerboard, like man-made old ruins. Now, Stanley, after you debriefed Harold and Ingo on the phone, Ingo says you all sat in silence for a very long time, drank several bottles of wine. What happened next? Was this material ever published before now?
I don't think that it's ever been published before now. And one of the reasons might be is the material is pretty outrageous because there have been space explorations to Mars. Nothing resembling these structures has ever been found. And I think that for that reason, it simply was not of interest to be picked up on before now. Mm-hmm. However, I have to tell you that at the time, I thought that he had gone to another planet or gone to someplace on the Earth, because in all of my reading about Mars, I had never seen references to anything that he and Harold Sherman were talking about. It wasn't until a few years later, after the Mars expedition by the space agency, that it suddenly clicked on me. Maybe Ingo was actually, and Harold too, maybe they were viewing into the future. And the structures that they were talking about certainly did resemble the materials and the structures that were sent by rocket to Mars by National Space Agency and which are there to this day. You know, abandoned, but they're still there in some form or another.
Ingo went back to Mars in 1984 after the face and pyramid photos by NASA were beginning to create a stir. And as a matter of fact, though, however, we need to take a break right now, and we will return with Dr. Stanley Krippner. Our guest is Dr. Stanley Krippner, and we are talking about the introduction he wrote to the new chapter about Mars included in Ingo Swann's Penetration Special Edition, The Question of Extraterrestrial and Human Telepathy. Order the book and get more information at ingoswann.com or theprophecyproject.com. We'll be right back. This is 21st Century Radio.
Hello, I'm Dean Radin, author of Entangled Minds, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
The little clip from the original interview we did with Ingo Swann about this book in February of 1999, and not focusing on what is inside of them rather than what is outside of them that is important, and which is the main goal of 21st Century Radio. Remember, we have 2 laws on 21st Century Radio that I'm sure that Ingo Swann is not aware of. The first law is that we are not alone in the universe and never have been. That's key to 21st Century Radio. And you know what the other law is?
Well, I knew that.
Yeah.
I knew that.
Well,
what's the other one?
What do you think the other one is?
I don't know.
That human beings come in at least 2 parts. One is mortal and the other is immortal.
Oh.
And it's the
I know that too. I guess
well, that
I do
makes
anyway.
for in this part of the country, in this part of the town of Baltimore and Owings Mills, etc. That is radical thinking. We are returning now with Dr. Stanley Krippner, who witnessed the remote viewing of Mars performed by Ingo Swann in 1975. Ingo Swann's archives, as well as Stan Krippner's archives, are housed at the University of West Georgia, and you can access them through the links we posted at 21stcenturyradio.com. Third caller right now will win a copy of this new special edition of Penetration, including the newly discovered chapter on Mars. Call us at 410-922-6680 or 1-800-WCBM-680. Third caller wins. Now, Stanley, let's get back to these questions. Well, Ingo went back to Mars in 1984 after the face and pyramid photos by NASA were beginning to create a stir. Joseph McMoneagle was also sent to remote view the anomalies on Mars in 1984. Stan, do you know if both McMoneagle and Swann were provided coordinates from the same source?
I was not a part of that experiment, so I really don't have all of the details. But Joe McMoneagle, as some of your listeners know, is, along with Ingo Swann, one of the premier remote viewers, and both of them have engaged in numerous experiments that have been published. And Joe has often also written his own account, a very good book about remote viewing. Ingo Swann wrote a few books which were fictional accounts of space travel, and they were superb. I think your listeners might check out them on Amazon.com. Ingo was a multi-talented person. Not only was he a remote viewer par excellence, but he was a splendid writer, and of course he's best known for his artwork. And whenever I would go and visit him in his apartment in the Bowery in New York City, he would always be working on a new painting. And the topics of his paintings, as years went on, were almost invariably views from outer space. And so I thought that was a way that he could combine his remote viewing abilities with his artistic abilities.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, he did a lot of pyramids, and as a matter of fact, do you think there is a connection between the pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mars?
Well, first of all, I'm not convinced there are human-made pyramids on Mars. I think that there are geological structures that from one viewpoint might look like pyramids, but let's not go there because I'm very, very skeptical that there are any pyramids on Mars. What I'm more interested in are the plethora of pyramids around planet Earth.
For sure.
Because we are discovering pyramids left and right as archaeologists go to different parts of the world, and I don't think that they were copying each other. I think this is the basic archetypal form, and that humans that wanted to honor the skies, reach up to the skies, what better way to do it than to build a pyramid? There are still mysteries of the pyramids in Egypt, as you well know, because you've been a very diligent scholar of this. But there are smaller pyramids that I have visited in Ecuador, in Belize, and then, of course, I have visited all of the major pyramids in Mexico. Marvelous structures. And instead of claiming that aliens were helping humans build these pyramids, I think that this is something that's intrinsic to the human psyche. Humans have the intelligence, they have the collective unconscious, and so they just went ahead and built the pyramids on their own. But each pyramid in each different part of the world had to be built in their own ways. And remember that, as far as we know, the pyramids in Mexico were built without any sort of wheeled vehicle. They had to be dragged. The stones had to be dragged and put in place. What work, what ingenuity. And I think that pyramidology, as the topic is called, is a fascinating area of study, and I know it's of interest to your readers, and books like The Mysteries of Great Pyramids, pyramids around the world are easily available. New books coming out all the time on pyramids. And so it's no wonder that Ingo was also captivated by that archetypal image.
Ingo had some ideas about humans possessing deep genetic memories, end of quote, of the past, including so-called memories of Martians and other extraterrestrial phenomena. What do you make of that?
Well, this isn't as far out as you might think, because Carl Jung's notion of the collective unconscious held that all of humankind's memories from the past, even before humans were what we call humans today, were there someplace in the collective unconscious. And if people had contact with aliens millennia ago, yes, it would be there. And under the right conditions, people would have access to it today. In fact, many people have dreams about aliens, and this might actually be coming from the collective memories rather than from fantasy or wish fulfillment or any supposed contact with aliens today. It's a fascinating topic.
It sure is. It sure is. There are pyramids just about on every continent and on and many islands as well. It's extraordinary what happened over the past 2 or 3 years in locating so many. Stan, what can you tell us about Ingo's other planetary ventures with psychic Harold Sherman when they visited Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, and Mars in the 1970s?
Well, I might mention something that maybe your readers don't know, but Harold Sherman participated in the very worthwhile and historic psychic experiment when one of the polar explorers was taking off on an expedition, and Harold Sherman kept a daily log and charted just what the explorer was doing every step of the way. And again, this is all published, and so it's easily available. And there's a remarkable congruence between Harold Sherman's daily log and what the polar explorers were actually doing and actually finding. So Harold Sherman was really a pioneer in remote viewing and often really doesn't get the credit he deserves. Now, Ingo Swann, as best as we know, actually coined the term remote viewing, and he was right up there with the SRI International team that was working on top-secret research to come up with information, much of it very, very specific, where he would be given coordinates, as you say, and he would describe what could be found on those coordinates. Now, Ingo and I were good friends, and we had many delightful visits and conversations together. We never did an experiment together because SRI International, the former Stanford Research Institute, had the priority there. But he did consent to do some Kirlian photography work with me and my...
Oh, really?
And it was remarkable. This is all published in our book, Galaxies of Light, which came out about 25 years ago.
Oh, my.
That when we wanted him to expand the electronic discharge, he did. And there was a very, very bright aura around his fingertip. When we asked him to contract the aura, sure enough, he was able to do it. Now, remember that this was with a device that he had no previous experience with, but still he was able to modulate the electricity, the perspiration, the sweat, the heat, all of the different things that go into those beautiful auras that you see in the Kirlian photographs.
Tell us a little bit more about Harold Sherman. Could you share a little bit more on where he came from, etc., and who he studied under?
Oh, good heavens. But Harold Sherman was one of the pioneers in teaching people how to develop their psychic capacities. And he was one of the first people to write a well-informed book about how to develop your ESP, I think the title was. And He lived in Arkansas. He held a variety of seminars. I went to one of them myself. We had a delightful time, very interesting guests. And he and his wife were extremely charming, very hospitable. He and I, as I say, had a number of meetings over the years. Arkansas is pretty far away, so we didn't have a lot of contact. When I was living in New York, I was able to see Ingo quite frequently. But it'd be worthwhile for one of your guests to do a little bit of research on Harold Sherman and bring some of his accomplishments and history back to life into the mainstream.
Maybe we can do that sometime in the future. Well, we're just about out of time now, Stan. Thank you for joining us, Stanley Krippner. Friends, you can find the archives of Stanley Krippner's research housed at the University of West Georgia through the link on 21st Century Radio. Visit Ingo Swann's artwork in person at avam.org and learn more about Ingo Swann's remote viewing.
Stay connected with stimulating talk and breaking news on Talk Radio 680 WCBM, Baltimore, and WCBM.com.